Hello, my name is Dr. Gary Simmons, and this is part 3 in a video series called A New Funding Model for Evolving Out of Not Enough. And we've been looking at the sustainability of our minister-centric ministry practice and how its funding model is based upon our principle of tithing to where you're spiritually fed. And as I've mentioned in parts 1 and 2, this practice is currently not sufficient to sustain our ministries in this present economy. So I'd like to just conclude the conversation about the inevitable decline of congregational ministries, that as the traditionals or the greatest generation and the baby boomers age out, within 23 years, we will have to have converted to a total different funding model if we are to have sustainability. So right now, with declining attendance and with the loss of revenues associated with our tradition of tithing to where you're spiritually fed, absent of our rebranding that in the context of tithing as source, even still a tithing-based funding model seems to be impractical with respect to the cultural shifts that are occurring. The demographics of the millennials and the Gen Zs, and to a certain extent the dot-commers, aren't anymore in alignment with the principle of tithing. So we need to shift to tithing as source to align those who are already receptive to the principle of tithing as spiritual practice. We need to realign them to the principle of tithing as source so that we can avoid some of the pitfalls that happen when our branding of tithing is all about tithing to where we're spiritually fed, because as I mentioned in the previous video, it's very easy for us to then kind of be in the question as to wondering whether or not we've been spiritually fed this week, as to warrant our full recognition and appreciation of that effort. When we extricate our funding model out of this value system that is really linked to whether or not people feel okay about what's happening, as opposed to a greater integrity of their own sense of being in ownership of what's happening, when we shift to this new paradigm, we have to transition. It's not something that we can just lay on to the congregation overnight and expect immediate results. And so what needs to happen next is for you to have a coherent understanding of the overarching structure and principle of the ownership-based funding model, as well as to how it rolls out, or how it lives as being an executable program that's introduced, that's sustained and brought forth and integrated as a part of the ministry's practice. As I introduce the various elements of the ownership-based funding model, I want to also talk about what's happening at Unity Spiritual Center here in Spokane and how we're introducing the funding model, as well as how it is rolled out and sustained within the context of our transitioning from minister-centric to mission-centric ministry. And so the first thing that's important is to understand that we have a couple of goals with respect to our new funding model, and that is to 100% underwrite the expenses of our ministries through automatic or electronic transfer of funds. So as we move towards this goal, we understand that this is important because people only tend to give when they're present in our churches. And so when we can be assured of their contribution and support independent of their attendance, then we have amplified our capacity to make sure that those who are connected to our ministry to participate in helping us sustain our operations. And so towards this aim of 100% underwriting the expenses of the church through automatic giving, in the context of 100% ownership, in other words, our entire community in ownership, owning the financial sustainability of our ministry operations, for that to occur, we have to set that as a goal of what our transition process is all about. In other words, when we're shifting out of a tithing-based system to an ownership-based system, we're going to set as our goal 100% underwriting of our expenses through automatic giving. And then when it comes to accepting or receiving love offerings on Sunday, independent of our 100% underwriting of our organization, we can then take those proceeds and either give it away within our local community, which is what our intention is to do here at Unity Spiritual Center Spokane, or we can fundraise for special projects. In other words, our effort won't necessarily be so focused on trying to coax out of our community the support that's needed. Instead, we'll have the support and we'll be about the business of fulfilling our purpose, transforming lives and inspiring people to make a positive difference in their world. So as we move towards that intention, there's some things that we have to introduce in order to keep that principle in front of people and help them live into it organically, as opposed to it being a bolt-on program that is tried and then fades away after our initial enthusiasm. So I'm wanting to introduce now a principle that I'm going to call holding up the mirror. And what this means is that from time to time the community expects and welcomes the holding up of our financial state of being, so that everybody can see this is how we're doing right now in the context of our being in ownership of this organization and its effort to fulfill its purpose. And so wherever we live in the context of meeting that need then becomes our growing edge. And so while we might only be in 30% ownership, let's say, of our entire expenses, we can use that as a benchmark for beginning our systematic movement towards 100% underwriting of the organization. So I want to give you an example of what I mean by holding up the mirror. And so literally it's a slide, a PowerPoint slide, or it's some intentional presentation of the state of financial being with respect to how the community is being funded and supported. And so, for instance, at Unity Spiritual Center in 2017, we had an annual need. Our expenses were over $315,000. And so that becomes the benchmark. So in effect, holding up the mirror begins at a starting point. And so our holding up the mirror begins at our annual membership meeting. And so to introduce this in a coherent way that builds on the momentum and its sustainability in terms of it being reinforced and talked about and developed as a concept, as a value within the ministry, we begin someplace. And so here's a picture of our holding up the mirror before our community, and as you can see, our need for 2017 was $315,000. And among, let's say, our community, we have calculated that we have approximately 200 people that we can count on to have some financial relationship with our ministry. And so this is something that you would need to do. You would need to calculate how many people, not members or not Sunday attendees, but rather the people that you know that are connected to your community in a real, authentic way, insofar as their participation in funding the ministry. Obviously, those folks who just come in on the religious holidays and contribute, we're not counting those people, but we're counting the people that if everyone was to show up on the Sunday that felt like they were a part of our community, we'd have about 200 people. And then after you get a sense of how many people you have in your ministry, you look at how many people are involved in some form of automatic giving, virtue either bill pay or a tithing app or consistent giving that you can track. The point is that you're wanting to establish a benchmark where you have so many percentage, a percentage of your total population of those that you can count on. What is the percentage of that group of people, of let's say 200 people? We have 68% or 136 individuals and households within that 200 population. That's 68% of our community, but we only provide 65% of what's needed with respect to our total operations. And so we still have 32% of our community that is not involved in any form of automatic giving, plus we have some distance to close the gap between how much we take in terms of our total love offerings and how much that contributes towards the expenses. And so for us, all of our love offerings total only 84% of all of the monies that is needed for us to underwrite the expenses of our organization. So consequently, we have to make up 16% of what's needed, or approximately $50,000, through other avenues of income, such as fundraisers or facility use and other things that I'm sure that many of you are involved in, such as pledge programs or other ways in which you are being mindful of both of managing your expenses as well as leveraging whatever assets you have that can generate more income. But suffice to say that we want to minimize the extemporaneous ways in which we are leaking energy to try to maintain our operations and move towards a sustainable funding practice that enables us to not worry or stress about what's happening with respect to how people are feeling about whether or not they're spiritually fed. So when we shift into a more mature concept of engaging the responsibilities of a community in the context of ownership, then we're evolving the whole system. We're evolving people out of this sense of needing to feel cared for or served, and instead empowering people to really take ownership of their life and stepping up and partnering with us as New Thought leaders so that we can move our organizations into something that's relevant and meaningful and impactful, especially during these times. So as you consider holding up the mirror, of course you just don't want to introduce this cold. You have to develop your community and get them to a place where they welcome that feedback. Ultimately, in the mission-centric model of ministry, where ownership is the foundation of our financial support, we want people to engage and value their effort. And so from time to time it's important that we hold up the mirror and say, this is how we're doing in the context of the need that we have. Now, obviously, in regular intervals when this happens, let's say it happens twice a year, and then more often if there is a need that translates into the necessity of everyone understanding what is the current situation, so that people understand when the mirror comes up, there's a need for people to know, because that's what owners want. They want to know what's going on way before it becomes a crisis. And so ideally and ostensibly, in the context of an ownership community, a value-based system around ownership, we welcome the feedback. And because, as I'll mention in just a little while, people participate equally in their owning of the ministry's financial journey in the context of what they can do. And so the question is not what am I doing in the context of my practice of giving and supporting the church, but what can I do in the context of here's the mirror and this is the need. And so when everybody's in ownership and everybody is in the intent to do what they can do, then herein works the magic and the miracle of what happens when we feel interconnected, when we all feel a part of something bigger, when we all feel connected to an intent that moves us into expression of what our capacity is to make a world that works for everybody. I mean, this is possible, and as we bring people into the effort and the intent and develop them and give them what they need in order to understand the conditions and circumstances that necessitate this movement towards a new ministry practice and a new funding paradigm, when people understand what's needed and are given a sense of here's how we can make a difference, people will jump on it. And I got to tell you, after I presented the talk here at the Unity Spiritual Center Spokane, and if you have watched the talk and listened to the message with respect to my presentation at Spiritual Life Center in Sacramento, and listen to the response of the community, you will get that this is a message that people welcome, because they also feel the discomfort of living in their own sense of not enough. And when the ministry is able to be publicly, openly practicing in the practice of disengaging from the organization's sense of not enough, and that becomes a theme within the ministry. And as the ministry deepens in its own shadow work, then we can actually disentangle from this belief that we're not enough. And we can actually come from this place of radical generosity and really make a difference. It's just a matter of shifting our context for how we're being in this question of how can we bring people into a greater expression of who and what they've come here to be for the fulfillment of a purpose that our world so desperately needs right now. And how could each individual, from the context of their own capacity, do what they can do, and in that effort participate equally to move the whole ministry forward. If we can't create that kind of possibility, then we're still living in the old way, and we have to shift. And so holding up the mirror becomes the first way of being able to condition the community to welcome receiving information with respect to how we're doing. And so I'm going to expand on what we can do with the principle of holding up the mirror and the metrics that we identify that are important to actually seeing movement from both the amount of people who are involved in automatic giving and the amount of funds that are coming forth with respect to owning the entire expenses of the ministry. So those two metrics are going to be things that we're going to track, and we're going to see how the tracking lives in the broader context of the whole system implementation. The next consideration in the ownership-based funding model is to look at the phenomenon called Pareto's principle, the idea that 20% of our community provides 80% of the resources. Increasingly, a separation between the haves and the have-nots. In other words, we have within our own communities a microcosm of what's happening in our world. We have people of means who are becoming more capable and with respect to their ability to manage these unchanging times, and then we have the majority of the folks kind of caught up and being modulated by the incoherence and the uncertainty, the unpredictability, and the economic conditions of what's happening in our world today. The majority of our people are affected by that, affected by their own sense of not enough. But when we look at the demographics of those who have means in comparison to those who don't have means within our church, we can see that 20% provide the majority of resources, and this is a natural distribution in a funding model that's based upon people's capacity to participate in what is ostensibly a pay-as-you-own or pay-as-you-value what is happening in your relationship to the ministry, as opposed to a sustainable spiritual practice. So whereas 30 years ago, tithing as a spiritual practice, tithing to where one is spiritually fed, was a sustainable practice that did indeed underwrite our ministry's operation in the day. But nowadays, with the greater sense of not enough and the growing distinction between the haves and the have-nots, it means the majority of our people in our church do not have the means necessarily to contribute at the same kind of intensity and depth as we've enjoyed in previous decades. So our effort now needs to kind of back away or dial back away from the phenomenon of not only a tithing-based funding model, which is based upon people valuing their experience and feeling spiritually fed, wherein in that context, only a small percentage of people can make a significant contribution to offset our indebtedness or our expenses. So as we move towards evolving our funding concept to shift out of a tithing-based system into an ownership-based system, we're wanting to understand that this transition is going to have to contend with, or rather reconcile, the distinction between a small group of people have the means to support the majority of the operations of the church, and that dynamic has to, we have to disentangle from that dynamic because it fosters too much drama and politics within our organization. We tend to move our efforts towards making sure that our major stakeholders are happy and okay with how things are going. And it's very difficult to enroll more people into ownership when our tithing-based funding system basically maintains Pareto's principle as an intact phenomenon that very little can alter. So as we move towards a different funding model, a different context for engaging people in supporting our ministry, we have to look at how we can reconcile the disparity between those who have means and those who don't, and recognize that there's a growing gap between those of means and those who are struggling right now in this economy. So as we move towards an equality that is based not on how much people give, but the intent behind their gift, and what is important to them in the context of ownership and ultimately partnering with the ministry leaders. When we understand what goes into that shift, into that different consciousness around which we participate in our financial relationship to the ministry, we're opening up a dimension that is yet to be fully inhabited and experienced in New Thought. We have yet to create a paradigm of ministry practice that's funded by the intent of those who are in ownership to partner with the leaders to make sure that the needs of the church are fully realized, and there is not the stress of not enough that is interfering with the fulfillment of the purpose of our church. So how do we do this? How do we make everyone's effort to be in ownership equal, and therefore at the same time be more than enough to embrace all the needs and the expenses and the obligations of the ministry? So that requires a little thinking outside of the box. And so we want to bring in a principle that helps us go there. And that principle is interbeing. And I've talked about the principle of interbeing, a phrase that Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh has made famous. The idea that we're all interconnected, that we cannot look at a piece of paper, for instance, and not see the cloud, and not see the forest, and not understand the web of life that is brought forth. This expression of any form that we might enjoy in our life is realized because of our interconnection, of our oneness. And until we create a funding model based upon that principle, we don't actualize the field of infinite possibilities to kind of override whatever is the circuitry of the story of separation, you see. And so when we are in the question, how can we make everyone's effort equal, and how can each effort be enough to engage and fulfill the needs of the whole? And so perhaps we can approach this subject with a little story. So I have a new interpretation of the feeding of the 5,000. Are you ready for it? You won't find this printed anywhere, but you can use it if you like. So here's Jesus. He's got to feed these 5,000 people. Of course, that's the story that we've been given. And so he asked the disciples, well, what do we have? And we have fishes and we have bread. Okay, well, so he blesses it, and he sends them out to go distribute it, the food to the multitudes. So this is what I imagine happens. So in the story of separation, you know, everybody is hungry and eating, but no one is willing to expose what they brought on this pilgrimage to be with Jesus. You know, I mean, they just think you don't go someplace to be with 5,000 people and there not be a bathroom or at least some provisions for food, for lunch, for snack. And so people probably had stuff, but it was the circumstance, the intent to bring people into the experience of them creating a bounty out of their sense of not enough, their sense of lack. And so here comes the disciples basically asking people, if you have something to share, go ahead and share it. If you need to take something, you don't have anything, go ahead, but do what you can. Just do what you can. And so here I imagine the disciples going through the masses, and okay, here comes somebody, you know, out from underneath their robe, they have a Snickers bar or a bag of peanuts or you know, whatever is what they would carry with them. But the point is that after the Spirit moved through everybody, there was a spirit of sharing, of owning the experience that those 5,000 people came together to create. That the bounty, that the abundance, the more than enough came amidst the demonstration of insufficiency, in the midst of it, and because of it. And so we can create the very same experience. It's just that we have to have the right context to bring people into the value system of really coming from a place where they're empowered to really do what they can. And if you've listened to the talk that I did at Spiritual Life Center in Sacramento, you've already heard the principle that we invite people to do what they can with respect to the needs of the church. Remember, we're holding up the mirror from time to time. We've conditioned the community to welcome that. And the next piece that I'm adding to your understanding of the ownership-based funding model is that we invite people in the presence of what is needed to do what they can. Not to do what they're doing, but to do what they can. So here's the important point of principle. We need to acknowledge that however many people there are in our community, at Unity Spiritual Center in Spokane, we have approximately 200 people that have some authentic relationship to the church. And that's our community. That's what we have to work with. And we're not looking to increase those numbers. We're looking at just looking at the people who are participating in our community and bringing them into greater ownership, bringing them into a greater sense that this is important in their lives. And we know that this is important in their lives is because their lives are being transformed. And this is the important linkage between this new funding model, an ownership-based funding model, and the mission of the church, because it's not going to work if we don't have a purpose that is really pulling us into ownership, such as transforming lives can do. And this is what we're experiencing here at Unity Spiritual Center, because as we open ourselves to the intent to own this that we're creating together as being a means by which people can have the felt experience of moving themselves into a greater expression of their well-being. When they have that experience, they don't have to think about, well, I'm wondering if I'm spiritually fed. They just have to reflect upon the quality of their life and where they've been and what has happened in their life and their relationship to the ministry, and they can see that this is something that they want for everyone to experience. So there is no gap between the desire that this needs to succeed and thrive and that intent to make sure that this is going to be something that is sustained and that we can move forward with this. So another way of looking at this whole principle of interbeing, this whole idea that when we access a different context with respect to what we're having, we open up dimensions of possibilities, is looking at interbeing in the context of the field of infinite possibilities. In other words, right now when you consider all the people who are in an authentic relationship to your church, and let's just say, as I've used in my example, there are 200 people, and all of those people have different means. They live in different relationships to the energy of money, but yet everyone in the spectrum, everyone in our community, each of those 200 individuals can do what they can do in their relationship to the need that the ministry has. And so this brings everybody into an equal participation in the principle of ownership. And so the crux of the effort is to bring the value of ownership online in a systematic way that is less about owning something external to oneself, more about owning one's journey, owning one's shadow, owning one's relationship to this that is bringing forth a greater good in one's life. And so when we link ownership with our purpose and with the intent to create a world that works for everyone, when we link ownership, the value of ownership, to our sense of maturity, our sense of our capacity to partner and to create something that the world needs, it ups the game. It brings us into a heightened sense of what our capacity and purpose is that enables us to transcend some of the limitations of our of what's going on in our world today. And one of those limitations is the sense of not enough, obviously. And so as we look at the ministry, I can see at Unity Spiritual Center that if all 200 people were doing what they can do in the presence of what the need is, we would absolutely be able to, right now in this moment, 100% underwrite our expenses, just simply by this one principle. Now, the fact of the matter is that not everybody is doing what they can do. They're doing what they're doing. And based upon where they are and their own way of being with what's happening in their world, in their economy. And so we need to be able to provide a means by which people can transcend their own limitations. And while they may be reluctant to participate in a tithing program or a prosperity class, especially when it requires of them to give in a way that they're not accustomed to, or give in a way that lives outside of their sensibilities, or give in a way that is stretching them beyond their capacity to really be comfortable with what's being requested of them. But when they shift into the awareness that what is being asked is people do what they can do, not only do they feel better about that effort and their intent, but they feel that they're participating just the same way as somebody else who has greater means is participating. So this is an important principle of this new funding model, but it's important to know also that you just can't give the talk and it's just going to, okay, from now on, we're not going to do tithing anymore, we're all going to be owners. It's just not going to work like that. It's going to take some time for this to evolve. So as we look at the principles of the new funding model, the ownership-based funding model, we're looking at cultivating ownership as our means of funding the organization. And that means, that necessitates moving out of trying to get more as a remedy for our sense of not enough. And this is an important shift. And it's a shift that we have to do within ourselves, because we have to convince the field. In other words, we have to convince the presence, our higher selves, whatever is governing the intelligence of the manifest into form phenomenon. We have to convince the agency of this greater good that we are in alignment with this principle, that we're all going to be invested in owning this that we're trying to create together. And if that's our intent, then the big gap in the effort to really do what we can is each individual being in an integrity with that sense of, I am doing what I can do in the presence of this need. Okay, so that's going to take time to evolve. And so there's no quick fix with respect to our funding crisis. We're not going to throw out tithing, but we're going to shift the focus of tithing, tithe as source, because it eliminates many of the unintended consequences of Pareto's principle. And so as we shift to this new effort of really talking about ownership and really putting ownership amidst the community for them to interact with the value system itself, I'll have much more to say about how that value system is introduced and how it evolves over time. This new funding model will be difficult to bring forth, to come online, unless there's a depth of shadow work that has taken place, so that people can see not enough active in their life and recognize it for what it is. It's simply a limiting belief. It's not who they are, it's not their identity, it's not their truth. But here is a principle that's important. We find this in Scripture. To him who has, more shall be given, and to him who has not, even that which he has shall be taken away. So whenever we're engaged in not enough, we create more not enough. And we're doing that with our current ministry practice. The minister-centric ministry practice, the tithing-based model of ministry, is unsustainable because it is insufficient to really bring forth the dimension of what's needed of ourselves now in this world. Can we not see that's what's needed is not us kind of languishing in our not enough, but for us to be in the struggle of overcoming that limiting belief. And what better way to demonstrate that that is possible through bringing people together to create that very experience of creating a ministry experience that is not only sustainable, but is a source of transformation and a movement towards creating a world that works for everyone. So I think I've sufficiently given you a sense of what this new funding model looks like in the context of a distinction between a tithing-based funding model and a ownership-based funding system. In addition to what I've conveyed so far, let me also suggest to you that one of the important benefits of moving to an ownership-based funding model is that we want we want to create owner partners in our community. In other words, we want people to feel like they're partnering with us as leaders, and we want to feel like we have partners in our work, so we're not doing this in an independent silo, but we're leading and we're participating and moving our ministry forward in the partnership with our owners, because that's the way in which we create something that is sustainable. And so there's a lot of things that we have to do differently in this new ministry practice that are counterintuitive, because we're so ingrained in the minister-centric model of ministry and its practice. And so we have to totally re-language the narrative, our story, how we talk about our purpose and how we're being in our effort to elicit support. And so we have to shift away from service opportunities to ownership opportunities, for instance. We have to create ease with respect to how people can set up their electronic or automatic giving. And so there's a lot more for me to talk about that creates more understanding with respect to how this thing gets executed and how it's sustained over time. But suffice to say that this new funding model doesn't live independently of the mission-centric ministry coaching program, because it's embedded in it. Because you don't want to bring on the new funding model just out of the blue. It has to live in the context of the systems and practices that are there to sustain it. For instance, the integral membership system, which will be another video series that I'll produce in time, will be the primary instrument to cultivate ownership. And I haven't talked about the actual process of cultivating ownership yet, but in the integral membership system, a phased approach to bringing people into ownership, it's a seamless path from first-timer to competent leader. But in that system, we introduce in two separate phases. The first is the principle of a minimum member contribution, where we invite people into being in integrity with what expense it is to have this ministry operate. And so, for instance, in our ministry, we need $315,000, at least that's what the need was for last year. If we have 200 people, we divide that need by 200 and we come up with about $1,500 and change per month, or per year, per person, in order to equate to $315,000. And then we divide that by 12, and that's about $130 per person per month. And so we invite people to begin their journey with us by making that the benchmark to begin their financial relationship to our church. And so I'm going to talk about how that process has worked for us. It has worked very, very well. And I'm going to share information about how to introduce a minimum member contribution as the first phase of membership. We have two phases in our system: community member phase and then a governing member phase. And we liken our process to a labyrinth walk. And once again, I'll say more about that later. But suffice to say that in the first phase, people are introduced to the minimum member contribution. And then in the governing member phase, they're introduced to the principle of ownership and partnership. And so those nuances will be revealed to you as these videos are produced. But suffice to say that independent of a structure that brings people as an organic process into the system, it's very difficult to implement, because what happens is you do a talk and the people are there, get the message, but the first time they hear it is not deep enough for them to take it to the next level. So if they hear the message over and over and over, and so part of that is sculpting the narrative that begins to introduce some of these concepts. And then in the course of the community's life, there are systems and practices that naturally bring into people's awareness systematically the various components that enable them to deepen in their relationship to the ministry. The next thing I'd like to talk about is simply to reflect on the importance of having a transition process, or at least to take into consideration that we have to transition from our tithing-based to an ownership-based funding model. It's going to take time. In the context of the coaching program, it's not introduced until after significant effort has been made in really educating people with respect to the dynamics of the church's past and some of the issues that have to be dealt with before the field is clean enough to be able to welcome change and to welcome the introduction of new structures, practices, and systems that will alter the way people are in relationship to the ministry and bring on these new value systems. So all of this is very difficult to convey in a video presentation such as this because it's one way. You don't have the ability to ask me questions, and I know that there are lots of questions that need to be asked and answered. And that's really the best way to convey the nuances and the deeper details, because it's just too much for me just to assume by my sharing that you're going to have your questions answered. And because so much of this lives as an embedded component of the coaching program, it's important that you have a sense of what is the context within which the new funding model lives, because otherwise you're just going to attempt to try to implement some of these ideas, which, you know, who wouldn't want to take advantage of an opportunity to introduce something that perhaps has a chance to make a difference. But my concern is that independent of you having more information about what else is a part of this process of really bringing your people into a new paradigm of ministry practice, it takes a strategy. And so I'm wanting to give you that strategy, at least convey the clarity that I have thus far, and now are starting our 4th year at Unity Spiritual Center Spokane. So in this series, a new funding model for evolving out of enough, I've tried to make the case that our current tithing-based funding system is insufficient and not capable of sustaining us during these times. And because of the story of separation has exacerbated people's sense of not enough, and because our tendency is to try to get more when we're feeling less than, and that tends to exacerbate our sense of not enough because of the principle, to him who has been given, more shall be given. To him who has not, even that which he has shall be taken away. Because of that principle, we have a tendency to create more lack in our life, especially in our ministries, by focusing on what we don't have. And so the shift here is all about being more rather than getting more. But the being more has to live in a values context if we're to really align this effort with funding our church. And so our intent is to really cultivate a dimension of people's capacity that lives outside of their self-system. In other words, being more has to kind of override a person's habits of being. In other words, if they are in the habit of being insufficient or not enough, then it's very difficult for them to open to being more in their life and therefore doing what they can. And so that's why it's so critical to have a shadow work as a component of this evolutionary process. Actually, it's just not going to be sustainable without shadow work, because people's not enough will derail it. And trust me, I've already had the experience of dealing with the sense of not enough and how it's been an obstacle to moving people to get to a place where they can open themselves to what is possible. And so it's a challenge. So I'm intimately aware of the difficulty and challenge that ministry leaders have in this economy, in this day and age, with helping to move our ministries forward. It's very difficult to be on purpose when we're dealing with the sense of not enough. It's very difficult to evolve our church when we're stressed out and we're kind of sabotaging ourselves because we're so distracted and we lack coherence and focus. So the aim of this program is to create coherence and tipping points that shift your culture into a new paradigm in ministry. But it can't happen without clarity and intent behind what we're bringing forth. And so I'm going to invite you to learn more about the coaching program, because it is ready and available to support you in your work right now. So with that said, I wish you well. God bless you.